Henry Creel turned Vecna is the tragic case of what can happen when a traumatized child mistakes power for safety, when control is seen as the cure and the real cure never comes. It's easy to look at Henry and just think that he has a sick and twisted mind. But what if I told you that aspects of his same thought processes occur in many, if not most, of people that experience some kind of trauma? So continue forward in the rest of this video at your own risk to maybe empathize with and even maybe identify with certain aspects of a person who we were made to believe was the villain of this entire series.
You were just a kid like me, and it used you. You're just like me, Henry.
Hello everybody, my name is Sabrina. I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel I talk about psychology as we see it in popular Netflix TV series and films. And obviously today we'll be talking about Stranger Things, specifically the character of Henry Creel, aka One, aka Vecna. And I want to start more global in this video and then make it a little bit more specific, meaning I'm going to talk about trauma kind of a little more generally and how it can change our thought processes and how we view people, interact with people, and then talk about how that relates to what we see in Henry/Vecna. So to get started, I want to talk about a very, very common type of therapy that is used to treat trauma. It's known as CPT, aka cognitive processing therapy. And in this, the first session of CPT is basically just kind of like the therapist talking and giving information about trauma and how it changes the brain and just understanding trauma a little bit more. And so in that first session, one of the things that we talk with clients about is what's known as the just world hypothesis. And what this says is that most of us, even without realizing, like from when we're kids, that we have kind of this underlying belief that the world is just and fair. Often that might be kind of taught to us even from parents or other folks, even like religion, whatever, and it goes a little something like this. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and if you do what's right, then good things will happen to you. This belief really helps us to feel grounded. It gives us a sense of predictability and control, which is so important because I mentioned a lot on my channel that really the main job of the brain, kind of be split into two, is to keep us alive and to keep us free from pain and discomfort, which often the pain and discomfort are associated with a threat to our life. So really to keep us alive. And being able to predict certain circumstances is so important to that, because if something is an unknown, I can't really prepare for what's unknown. There's going to be variables that are unaccounted for, and if it's a matter of my survival, the brain is not going to like that. So having a hypothesis like this where we can predict, okay, as long as I'm doing what I need to do and being a good person, that good things will happen. I don't need to worry about other things occurring. Like if the world is fair and just, then that makes sense because then I can feel safe. The issue is that trauma really disrupts this. When something traumatic happens, especially when it's sudden, when it's intentional, and when it's completely out of our control, this can be a huge problem for the brain. And thinking about what happened with Henry when he was in the caves and he ran across that guy and he tried to help him and the guy shot at him, that was very sudden, right? I think even when I first saw it, I kind of jumped myself that it came out of nowhere. It was intentional that he purposefully shot at him and then tried to end his life further from there. And that was something that was completely out of Henry's control for that to occur. He didn't know that hearing a scream and trying to give somebody help that they would try to then harm him in some way. Now, the trauma creates a problem when it comes to the just world hypothesis because it creates a conflict in our thinking. If the world is fair and just, then why did something unfair happen to me, right? Like thinking of the situation with Henry. We're often told that it's a good thing to do to help people in need. So if I'm doing a good thing and trying to help somebody, then why was I met with a reaction that was so negative and almost had my life ended because of it? right? And this leads to what's known as cognitive dissonance. I talk about this a couple times on my channel, but basically what this means is that our brain cannot hold two opposing viewpoints at the same time, that it must do something with it. So one way to resolve a conflict when we have conflicting beliefs is to, one, kind of ignore any of the new information that we get that contradicts our old beliefs. So what that might look like, especially with the trauma, if you think, okay, the world is generally a just and fair place, that if I'm a good person, good things will happen, what that might look like in a situation, say, for instance, like Henry's, might be the person turns inward and then says to themselves, okay, I must have done something wrong. Like if I had acted differently, this wouldn't have happened, that I should have known better. Like it's a way of saying, okay, the world is still just and fair, but this was my fault. So they can keep that belief about the world, and now it just becomes a them problem. Or the other thing that a person can do, which this more likely happens in Henry's case, which we'll talk about, is that you can kind of externalize it and you can completely change your belief. So if you believe the world is generally fair and just, and this unfair, unjust thing happens, now you can change that and say, okay, well, the world is completely dangerous. Like nobody can be trusted. I thought maybe I could trust, adults or people that were needing help, but nobody can be trusted now, right? Like you can completely change your belief. That one is often, it really depends, and especially with trauma, it can really be either or. Generally, completely changing your belief is harder to do, which is why we can see people, even in the face of certain evidence, still hold to a certain belief, because it's really hard, especially the longer you've held a belief, to just completely change that out of nowhere. Trauma is very different though, because that definitely can happen with trauma, because again, it's a matter of survival. So that's a little bit different. So when this happens, these thoughts, it's not a sign that there's something wrong with this person, or they're weak, or there's poor judgment. It's actually a sign that their brain is working as it should, because their brain is trying to help them to get back to a place of just safety and understanding and just order. I know it might seem kind of funny, but paradoxically, if we blame ourselves for something, then that actually helps us to be more in control, because now it's not just that something random, like bad things can randomly happen and come out of nowhere. It's me, and I can control me. Like if I do something differently, I can prevent this from happening again. So that actually helps us to feel in control, which is why, and maybe even you watching, which is why you might struggle with blaming yourself for things that might not be your fault, even to the point that people keep telling you this is not your fault, why do you keep blaming yourself for this, etc. Like it helps to give that sense of control. Same thing even with the opposite when it comes to trauma too, when you're blaming it on other things. Like if you're saying, well, it's just people, no people can be trusted, the world's completely dangerous, that also gives you a sense of control, because okay, if I can't trust people, then I just need to either completely avoid people or just not trust them, and then nothing bad will happen to me, right? If the world is completely dangerous, then I just need to avoid certain places. And this can feel safe, and we call this the illusion of control. It's an illusion because it's not really true. I had a client that shared with me one time that he was just sitting at home one day and randomly a car ran through his house. I can't remember if the person was drunk or having a medical crisis, something was happening, but that just happened. That came out of nowhere. He couldn't have controlled that. He couldn't have predicted that. And a lot of times when people experience trauma that happens kind of outside with people, I've met with a lot of people that they do retreat to a safe place, which maybe it is their home, and they might say, okay, as long as I'm here, I'm alone, I'm safe. I'm not around other people. I'm not around situations that I can't control, so I'm okay. But things like that could happen. A car running through your house, or natural disasters happen all the time that really impact and completely destroy people's homes, or even getting struck by lightning. Like things that are out of our control can happen. And so we call it an illusion, but our brain really hangs on to it. And the problem isn't the viewpoint itself. It isn't the desire to, say, want the world to be fair. In the case of the just world hypothesis, I would beg to say most of you watching, including myself, really long for and hope for a world where things are fair and things are just. That's not the problem. It's the rigid beliefs and the beliefs that are kind of no longer in line with reality that happen and that are continuing to actually bring more negatives into our life. Like, it does become a negative cycle. So, for instance, a lot of folks that I meet with that might have say some kind of combat related trauma, or even things where something happened in big crowds. Okay, they might say, all right, well, I just need to avoid crowds of people. If we think about that, though, that is so many of the places that we go, and depending on where you live, much more so. Like, more countries are full of people. So, for instance, that person now, they might stop going to concerts altogether that maybe they really enjoyed going to before. Maybe they will now change around their whole schedule so they only go to the grocery store first thing in the morning at like 5 a.m., or they only go super, super late at night on off days. Maybe they only go to the gym at random times in the day too. Maybe they're not going to the mall anymore, which might be something to enjoy. They're not going out to parties with friends. A lot of things that maybe they used to do, and now it's shrinking their life for the sake of safety and survival, which again, like I mentioned, is an illusion, because there are things that can happen. Even if this person puts barriers in place for all these things, there's still negatives that can occur. So now these rigid beliefs, it's only further impacting this person and their happiness and their life. So when it comes to CPT, for instance, it's really focusing on that, the new rigid beliefs that are now impacting this person. And so I wanted to talk about one other thing in addition to that, the just world hypothesis, and then connect it to Henry, these two things that I mentioned, because I think it'll really help to just get a good sense of what's going on with Henry. So the next thing is what's known as accommodation. So this can be under accommodation, over accommodation, or just the regular accommodation. I talk about this in the video that I do on PTSD that's on my channel, but a lot of people falsely think that PTSD is a common diagnosis, and or them or somebody they know has PTSD because they experience a trauma, simply because of the fact that now some aspect of their life or thinking has changed. The issue with this, though, is that we all have these what's known as mental models or schemas about ourselves, about other people, and about the world. And when something new happens, we are supposed to, it is healthy, we are meant to kind of adjust just enough to fit this new information in. So, for example, I am a woman, identify as a woman, and unfortunately for all of us who identify as women, and depending on where you live, this might vary, but I live in America, and so there comes a certain point where I do become more aware that my safety could be at risk depending on certain things that I do or not do. So maybe my worldview before is just that I am generally safe, walking outside, walking in this neighborhood. But now, after getting more information, and it doesn't even mean that something negative has to happen to me. It could just be learning more, that just learning like, oh, these things can happen more to women. Now my thought process might change that, okay, I'm generally safe where I live, walking around most times during the day. At night, I just have to maybe be a little more vigilant, especially depending on the areas that I'm going, right? Like that kind of accommodation is normal. And we actually hope that happens. It's healthy, because living in la la land is not healthy. So if I had this real information in front of me and I didn't change at least a little bit my behavior because of it, that wouldn't be beneficial either, right? So some other examples could be if somebody gets in like a serious car accident, maybe they might make some changes. Maybe they decide to get a car that can alert them if other folks are on their side, or maybe they do check just a few more times before they merge, etc. Those behaviors are beneficial. And so accommodating a bit is actually healthy. And people confuse this a lot. People think because they do that, that means they are traumatized. It is not. Remember, our brain's job is to keep you alive. And so it makes no sense for us to go through a trauma and our brain to not change at all because of that. Now the thing is, trauma does overwhelm this system, this accommodation system, and then can force us to go into one of two extremes, although some people can exhibit, and a lot of people do exhibit both. So one is what's known as under accommodation, and this is where people's beliefs don't change enough in the face of the trauma. So some examples could be them saying things like, oh, it wasn't that bad, didn't really actually affect me, it's not that big of a deal. This could be a problem because even though the person mentally is ignoring it, like the body still keeps the score. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it talks about how when we experience something, our nervous system is still aware of it. And so this person might still, would likely still be having things like nightmares and anxiety and irritability and all these things that occur. And the reason that we do this is because it does, or it can, shield you from feeling the emotional effects. Like if something is not that big of a deal, then I don't have to think about it and I don't have to process it. Now the next thing is known as over accommodation, and I apologize because I just realized my mic was not on the noise reducing setting, so if it sounds different at this point, my bad. If it sounded really bad before, my bad. Anyway, so over accommodation. So what this is when our beliefs become too global or too absolute. And what that means is that it could encompass everything, that there's no wiggle room, that it is very black and white. So some of that could be, I can't trust anybody, right? It's not just that I can't trust certain people, it's now I can't trust anybody. Even if it's I can't trust certain people, like if something happens to a person by, say if it's a man or whatever, even a person saying I can't trust any men, that's still very absolute, right? Like there are 8 billion people in the world, say half are men, that's a lot of people to say that you can't trust. So saying I can't trust anybody, the world is completely dangerous, if I let my guard down, something terrible will happen. And another is saying that I'm weak or broken. And remember that because we will talk about that very, very soon when it comes to Henry. And like I was saying before with some of these thought processes, it really can give a sense of control, because if the world is completely dangerous, then it is justified that I'm always being hypervigilant, right? I mean, it makes sense because I could be attacked at any time. But the issue with this is that a person is continuing to live out that trauma as if it's happening real time. So this can limit your relationships, your joy, your healthy risk-taking, and your recovery. I mean, we talked about that before, right? In terms of like the joy, like you might limit certain hobbies or things that you're doing because it's too dangerous, and so although you might feel justified, it just limits your own life. So the goal is a more balanced accommodation where we're not ignoring what happened, so acknowledging, okay, this was real and it was painful. Not over-blaming yourself, though, saying, okay, it wasn't my fault. Like, this did just happen, as scary as that might sound, and not being too rigid or too global. So knowing, okay, yeah, some people aren't safe, but maybe the vast majority are. And then maybe saying to yourself, like, I can learn to protect myself without completely shutting down my life. So this is the goal. Okay, so going back to Henry now and applying what we've learned about the just world hypothesis and accommodation to him. Some of the things that he mentioned, so in the very last episode of Stranger Things, we get a look into some of these thought processes and how they change based on this trauma that happened to him. He's saying to Will that, you know what, no, the world is broken. That man is broken. And actually, going back, I rewatched season 4, and in episode 7, he's having like that long monologue with Eleven and revealing to her about kind of how he came to be. He hears the same thing in terms of teachers telling him that he is broken just because he is struggling to manage trauma and struggling to, get along with other kids. And then he makes a comment about how his parents moved him to Hawkins thinking that things would be different and how absurd that was, as if the world would be any different, right? Like we can see this over accommodation that it's so global. It's the world, it's man, that they are broken. And then imagine, okay, well, if I'm broken just because I tried to help somebody that was needing help and then they attacked me, well, he must be broken as well. And then everybody in this world must be, if I can be, right? Like it kind of makes sense how he can get to that point point of understanding. And it makes sense generally how his worldview broke down, because when we think about the just world hypothesis, good things happen to good people, but he did a good deed, he did a good act, and he was rewarded negatively. He was rewarded by almost having his life ended. That is how he was repaid. And so why in the world would he still keep the view that the world is a great and beautiful place? And in episode 4, he goes even further to mention other worldviews such as humans are pests, the world is cruel and oppressive and governed by made-up rules, and one of those made-up rules likely being the rule that life is fair. And then he goes on to talk about how order is a straitjacket, and then tells Eleven that she is better than other people, right? That she is superior, and that is very likely how he looks at himself, because they're the same, right? Like, they have the same powers. We learned in the last season that, she literally came from him, and like blood-wise. And so that's also how he thinks of himself now in relation to other people. And so he's trying to very clearly take power back, which is very common for people who experience trauma, because you were powerless and didn't have control in a situation. And one of the ways we clearly see Henry trying to take back power is when he's talking with Will, and he says to him, he's like, no, I could have resisted it. I could have resisted the Mind Flayer, but I chose to join it. Which we can see is so out of touch with reality, because how? How in the world, as that child, did you choose to join the Mind Flayer? And then Will kind of confirms that, he was a kid just like him. They're probably the same age when the Mind Flayer took over Will. And in season 2, Will is trying his absolute hardest to stand up to and resist the Mind Flayer. And despite his best efforts, what do we see happen when he stood his ground and resisted and told the Mind Flayer to go away? What about when the Mind Flayer wanted to get revenge on those soldiers that had hurt him by burning the vines, and then they used Will to do it? Will is even saying, I didn't want to, he made me. And then we also see that his own family and friends had to tie him down and put him in a covered room so he wouldn't know where they were. That way the Mind Flayer couldn't use him as a spy to find them. Will in no way could resist the Mind Flayer, and Henry, at his same age, probably couldn't either. Henry was never in control, and when Will mentions to him that you were a vessel just like I was, unknowingly he did the worst thing he could do, which is touch on his helplessness in that moment. That is the last thing the traumatized brain wants to hear, based on everything we just talked about, saying you were completely helpless to this trauma that happened to you and what was going on. You were just a vessel, right? How does that sound to somebody who fears being in control, saying you had none in the moment? Doesn't sound great. And then because of that desire to be in control, but then also remember what we talked about with cognitive dissonance, not holding two opposing viewpoints. So Henry couldn't hold the viewpoint of, I was a child, I couldn't resist it, like I was weak, I was helpless, and also hold the viewpoint of, no, I'm in control, I do have power, I am strong. He can't hold both. And so what do we see? We see him decide in that moment to go with the one that gives him more power, saying, no, I did control it. And of course, if he has that viewpoint, he is in no way going to join Will and the other kids in helping to destroy the Mind Flayer. I mean, especially for somebody that feels like the world is broken, how appealing a being that comes and gives you the power to destroy the world. He even says to Eleven that he can reshape the world as he sees fit. How appealing for somebody who says the world is broken, man is broken, to completely eliminate the problem, eliminate man altogether, and to have the power to create your own world, a safe world. And so from that viewpoint, going to his first offing, which had to do with his parents, I mean at the time just his mom and his sister, he did that because he said that his mom specifically, but both of them, were trying to fix him. They're trying to get him to go to the doctor. And when that's the case, think about that. Like, if they did fix him, he'd go back to being helpless again. Like, now he has the power, like real powers, to actually do things. If that was taken away, now he has no power and no control. So from that standpoint, in his mind, it makes sense then that he had to off his parents as a last resort. I mean, it was a matter of survival.
You were just a kid. A kid like me, and it used you. You're just like me, Henry. A vessel.